I think Mr. Kendi is simplistic in a dangerous way. And I think that Ms. D'Angelo is going to have a lot to answer for. Because she set up a psychological abuse situation for people.
I want to hear more about that, Jamie. But yeah. I think John needs to refresh his page.
Okay.
So he has logged off. He'll be back momentarily.
Okay. I just want to say to you guys, you know, I was coming back from Thanksgiving up in Woodstock, New York, and I was on the bus and I listened to the Don Baton podcast again, and I listened to the most recent conversation you guys had about theater. And it made me upset that this professional in his field had to be incognito just to talk about some things that concerned him. And I was thinking about, I saw 92nd Street Y with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the late, great Ruth Bader Ginsburg, where she was extolling this thing of blind auditions for orchestras because women were being barred entry into orchestras. And it was this great thing. And it identified a bias and it corrected it in a large way. And now that's being changed. And I'm thinking, okay. And this is something you're not allowed to talk about as yourself. And I thought, you know, and John and I talked about my coming out because he's encapsulated my experience in a incredibly artful and anonymous way. And we talked a lot about my coming on here and what. So I was doing a show, and it's a jukebox music. It's probably the original jukebox musical. Yeah, I think, John, you encapsulated. There's a couple of episodes in this story that deal with race and the crossover between white musicians and Black musicians and cross-cultural marriage. And you've got your leading character marries, and it's a true story, marries a Latina. And it's a wonderful relationship that's shown with some resistance from his family. It takes place at a particular time in history. And there's this scene where the new wife is in the recording studio and the producer's wife starts making jokes about her ethnicity. And the thing that is a disconnect for me, and this is something that I really want to touch on, and I shouldn't be going on about other things because this is the thing. The scene itself would have been a release and a statement. It is a statement against racism. And the Latina character triumphs in this scene. She says, hey, you don't get to do that. You don't get to do that. You think I don't know what you're talking about? I speak English. Thank you very much.
It's all right there on the page.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's in the scene. And consequently, the leading character takes his wife and says, come on, let's get out of here, and breaks ties with his producer, with whom he's had a lot of success.
At this part. Yeah.
I mean, it's a moment of, no, you don't get to be a racist, right? And instead, you know, we're in rehearsal, and granted, a lot of this happened with all the company in the room. And there's a scene going on, and the scene stopped because the actress, the Latina actress, started berating this white actress because she wasn't being ugly enough in her bigotry in the scene. It was early days in rehearsal. The director was standing right there and really didn't guide this. And this white actress was struggling with playing a bigot. I don't see that is
that's supposed to be fragility in a way. Yeah.
Well, I just think anyway. And she was getting chewed out by this other actor, and you just don't give another actor a note. It's just kind of a
just stands there and watches this.
Let it happen. Yeah, I didn't really get it until later. I didn't really know what was going on. And then the white actress starts to cry, feeling kind of put upon, and everybody's watching this happen. And from out of nowhere, one of the other BIPOC members of the cast starts screaming. And I'm talking unhinged. levels of shrieking, gets up, charges over, gets in this woman's face and says, "You're not the victim. Stop crying. This isn't about you. This is not about you. This is about her. You just,
Right out of the playbook. Wow. This is D'Angelo.
Just completely unhinged. And there were 3 or 4 people just sort of screeching at this actress who's in tears. And the director's standing there and...
All of it is this recreational...
I didn't know that this was a thing. I didn't know what a disruption incident was or a triggering incident.
Yeah.
So the reason that I'm telling this story is not to throw anybody under the bus, because I truly think that people think they're doing the right thing.
They do.
I truly think that they believe that they're doing the right thing. But how do you do a social project without everybody being in on it? I just didn't understand what was going on. And I didn't know that this was a thing. So I'm thinking, why isn't anybody managing this? We don't do this to each other as actors in the workplace. A break was called. We all went away for half an hour. We were called back in, and then there was a circle up that happened to talk about what happened. And it proceeded to turn into a crying and sobbing and trauma, confessions and things from actors not in the scene, not involved, young BIPOC people who are still in college, who are doing their summer stock thing, sobbing and crying about how traumatic it is for them to walk into a rehearsal studio that's full of white people and how wounding that is. And I'm sitting there going, what is going on? I don't understand what's going on. Now, our director was a person of color, a man who really is terrific director, a man of integrity, and he was ostensibly monitoring this conversation, but just sort of let it play out. And I didn't know that my job as a white person was to be quiet and to be present in the face of this expression of trauma, and to be silent, which is hard for me anyway, as you've already probably surmised. And I'm sitting there going, yeah, but let's talk about professionalism and let's talk about how we don't give each other notes. So I was trying to bring it back to the work. Because to me, when things start to get personal and there's a lot of ancillary things being brought into a situation where we all have to work together, that's why we have a union. That's why we have certain protocols that are accepted. And I'm sitting there going, there's one director in a show, and he's right over here, and we don't do that. And they sneered at me. I had these young people sitting there like this. Do you know the beginning of To Sir with Love? Remember To Sir with Love? And Sidney Poitier walks into his inner city London school with a bunch of indolent, working class Cockney kids. And they're all sitting there like, it was like that. And I'm saying things like, we're union members. We're members of a union. And they're like, union. Ha! And I'm like, so I came to the defense of this white actress. And I said, look, from my own experience, in this show, I played this sort of good old boy Texan. And I had to say colored people 3 times. And on the first day of rehearsal, when I had this scene, I connected with the director. I said, how should this land? How do we want the audience to feel about my character in today's climate with this particular term? And we had a conversation about it, and we found a way to do it artfully and in a way that the audience would be okay with it. And I wasn't worrying about people of color in the audience. I was worrying about the white folks getting like, oh, I don't know if I should be here with it, because that's where we're at, right?
We are very much.
We dealt with it. Yeah, we dealt with it artistically. And I thought, that's the way to do it. So I related a story about a show that I did back in 2015. I was lucky enough to be part of a sort of a staged reading of a new musical called Loving versus Virginia. And Loving versus Virginia was about the Loving case, which overturned the anti-miscegenation laws in America. And the musical was written by Marcus Gardley, Obama's poet laureate. The music was by Justin Ellington. It was directed by wonderful Patricia McGregor. And I was brought in as one of a little 3 or 4 white characters in this, mostly people of color, wonderful piece, very confrontational about race. And I was cast as the redneck sheriff who was a personification of evil. And I had to spit tobacco and say the N-word, ad nauseum, and I had to try and rape.
Did you really have to spit tobacco?
Well, not really. I mimed it, but he was this flat out bigot, unapologetic, unflinching. And that was not easy for me. And what was interesting about it was we did our first read-through, table read. And this cast, I got to tell you guys, I was a fan of some of these people. I mean, we had some of the great people of color of the American theater in this cast. And I'm like, yeah, and then we do the read-through. And for the next week of rehearsal, the people of color avoided me. Like outside of rehearsal, and it was this weird, like, that's not really me, right? So we're sitting there having lunch one day, and I'm in the rehearsal room, and some people left the room, and I was there with a few of the people of color in the cast, and they were on their phones. It was all very quiet, and I'm going, let me start a conversation somehow. And there's a wonderful actress in the show. Her name is Carmen Ruby Floyd. And I don't know if you saw After Midnight when that was on Broadway. But it was this sort of Cotton Club, like capturing that era. And Carmen, she stole the show. She sang Creole Love Call. And she actually sang it on the Tonys, I believe. And yes. And she's just glorious. And I turned to her and I just said, hey, Carmen's a really unusual name. How did you get the name Carmen? And she went, well, my mother was a fan of Carmen McRae.
Right.
And I went, oh my God, she was one of my mother's favorites. My mother was into jazz because her father was into it. And my mom's a first generation Ashkenazi Jew, daughter of immigrants. Bless you, sir. And she's a jazz fan. So I grew up surrounded by this music. And within 5-10 minutes, Carmen and I and a couple of the other people in the room started having this amazing, lively conversation about Billie Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald and Nina Simone and all of these people. And I'm like, this is my childhood, So the reason I mention this is because I had, as part of this circle up at this theater, I said, I had to play somebody even worse than that hurt my spirit to have to do that. It hurt. But it was my job. And my job is to embody things that are uncomfortable. That's what actors do. And I don't understand this whole thing of people being so fragile that they can't. That's your job. That's your job. So I brought this up and I said, and it was very hard for me, particularly because my sister was Black. My sister was 6 months old when she was adopted. I was 4. And I grew up with a sister who was a person of color. And I've got 2 beautiful nieces and a nephew who are different shades of beautiful brown people. That's my family. And I brought this out and I said, this felt very difficult for me. And one of these actors says to me, you didn't have to bring up your sister. And I said, excuse me? You shouldn't use your sister as a prop. And I said, well, that's when I leave the room. And I got up and I left.
God.
Because I didn't know my job was to sit there and be silent.
And Jamie, I
was
outraged
by that.
This is, folks, what you're listening to is now a norm. This is not an eccentric story being told by one person. You are getting a vivid exposure to something that in the theater world is now a norm. And if anybody wants to say that people like Glenn and me are making up this attack on wokeness and that really we ought to be thinking about other things, that there's nothing significant going on, that all that's going on is that bad people are being held to account, How many people think that Jamie needed to be held to account for anything that he did? This is not about bad people being held to account. This is about a hostile religion taking over the way we think, the way we perform, the way that we reason. And this is real. Now, January 6th was real too. Book bannings are real too. Anybody who thinks that this is not important and that we should only be talking about Glenn Youngkin has a very narrow view of what it is to be a nation and what it is to be human beings. Jamie, continue.